Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to today's session. I'm Jennifer Splansky Jester, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum, and am so happy to be here with everybody today. Thank you so much for joining. So today's session is we are calling How Can We Move Beyond Transactional Towards Relational Collaboration? And I am so thrilled to be joined by two dear colleagues and friends, Kania and Juanita Zerda of the Collective Change Lab. And as you know, we are using today's time for primarily Q&A and hearing from you all and listening to the reflections that John and Juanita will be sharing. Before we do that, we will open the space with a land acknowledgement and have a few framing comments and centering by Juanita and John, and then we'll turn to the questions. As we go, you can feel free to share questions. Please do that in the Q&A box, but also feel free to use that chat box to connect with each other and share your own reflections to questions that folks are asking. We invite you into the space to share your wisdom as well. So with that, I would like to start with an acknowledgement that this session is being presented and recorded on the traditional land of the Massachusetts, Wabanaki, Ohlone, Coast Salish, Muckleshoot, Stillaquamish, Suquamish, and the Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people of these tribes. We also would love to have you participate in a land acknowledgement based on where you're joining us from today. So you can enter that in the chat, and we would love to have folks do so. If you aren't sure or want to double check, you can use these two resources here to determine what native lands you are on. The website here, native-land.ca, is a great service, as is the text option here that was created by Code for Anchorage, where you can text your city, state, or zip to the phone number on the screen. So I will just give a moment for folks to check in and do that in the chat. So welcome. I recognize the Tongva land in Southern California, the Lini Lenape, Ho-Chunk, many wonderful contributions coming in here. Nissan, Chinook, Clatsop, Piscataway. Feel free to keep those coming. Thank you so much. We also encourage you to go beyond the land acknowledgement. So the first step is understanding the lands, whose lands you are on. A next great step is to learn more about the people and the current context that is affecting the indigenous communities and tribes in your community. And a great resource on this is the Native Governance Center. They have some excellent resources on what they call moving beyond the land acknowledgement. So please do check out the resources from the Native Governance Center when you have an opportunity. So as I mentioned, the majority of today's session will be spent in Q&A mode. So you can use that Q&A part of the Zoom platform. We have it set so that you can upvote questions that you have the most interest in. So if you see something that looks interesting, rather than typing it yourself, you can upvote, and we'll keep an eye on those upvoting tallies as we sort through the questions. Today's session is also being recorded, and you'll get a notification with a link to that recording in the next day or two. So please keep an eye out for that. And if you have any technical questions, you can also put those in the Q&A box, and we'll keep an eye out for those as well. So with that, I am going to take down my slides and welcome Juanita and John of the Collective Change Lab to join us. So I'm going to hand it over to you all to take us through the next part of our session.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jen. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you to the Collective Impact Forum. I am so excited that you're part of our lives and that we continue to be in collaboration and partnership and continue to dream together. So I am here present today. And I would just, I see the numbers of folks coming in right now, moving up, and I'm seeing where some of you are arriving from, and I would just love for us to actually arrive together to this space. So I don't know if you're like me, but I've been running from between trying to get things done for my kids, which is the end of the school year, to being in sessions, to planning tomorrow. And often I find it very hard to arrive to spaces. And since today we're really going to talk about being relational versus transactional, I would love to steal some bit of the time that we have to arrive. So if you can please join me, and you might be a little bit, might not feel doing this, but just grace me with your generosity of joining me for a moment of breathing. So I am going to close my eyes because it always helps me, and it helps me not to get nervous, as I know I'm in a public space. And but some of you may not feel comfortable closing your eyes, might be maybe in a coffee shop, and it's just will feel strange. So maybe just look at something in front of you on your body that gives you that you find beautiful. And let's take a collective 3 big collective breaths. So in through your nose and out through your mouth. Try to make the inhalation and the exhalation long, like at least 3, maybe 4 seconds long. So we go in. And as you're finishing your 3rd breath, try to notice how your body's feeling. If you can touch the ground and feel the ground, or just like maybe focus on your shoulders. Do you notice them clenching up? Are they falling naturally? And as you're starting to notice your body, I invite you to have one question present. Just hold it, savor it, no judgment, just acknowledge it. How are you arriving today? In other words, what's in your heart? And as we prepare to be in community, acknowledging that we are not smelling each other, feeling the strong energy next to each other. We are in some strange but real way with each other. And that there is 250 more people right now in this moment from across the oceans, New Zealand, Colombia, Africa. And be grateful for that. And honor their present, but truly being present. I'm going to take one more deep breath together. And when you finish that deep breath, just say hello. It doesn't matter who's listening. Let's just say hello in your own ways. Hola. Hola, mis hermanos hispanos y hermanas hispanas. So we really wanted to start this way because we in a way have to I have to force myself to remember to be this way. And what I mean by this way is truly present. And it doesn't matter that it's a webinar. It doesn't matter that I'm not seeing you, or it does matter, but it shouldn't matter. What should matter is that I am connected. And we, in our work, what relational has come to mean to us is not only that we are in relationship with each other, but we are actually acknowledging the energy that surrounds us. And for me, that energy is much present when I am in silence. So if for 2-3 seconds, I allow myself to just arrive and feel what energy is around me, ideally the earth and the land where I am, I realize that I can actually be in much better relationship. And that's part of what we're going to be discussing today. There is certain difference into being relational and being in relationship. The first one is just a little bit more, for us, encompassing. And it goes beyond us. It is in between us and what's around us. So with that, I would love to introduce my colleague, John.
Thank you, Juanita, and thank you for that beautiful centering to start us out and connecting. So I'm going to set the stage, just with one slide as a framework, and I'm guessing some of you have seen it before. We published it, but really just to inform just what Juanita was talking about, how we see relational work and how it's different than just sort of being in relationship. So Jen, I'm wondering if you could put up that slide. Now I have to be careful because this is a coffee chat, and we want to get into conversation with you, and I could talk for the rest of the 45 minutes on this slide, so I'm going to try to do it briefly, but also try to just do it a little bit of justice. So the motivation for this comes from my experience doing collective impact work with many of you over the last decade plus, and sort of seeing that I always say if you want to change the system, get the system in the room. But often, I experienced two challenges. I wonder if you did. One is moving the system from thinking at a programmatic level to a system level, and the other is to how do we move out of focusing on sort of incrementally improving the status quo to transforming, right? And that's where this whole idea of relational work comes in from our standpoint. It was, based on my observation of my colleagues that, we can do good facilitation, we can do, we can bring data, and that's all good, and that helps, but often that'll get you to incrementally improving the system and maintaining the status quo, not getting to transformation where norms are shifted, where relationships are shifted, where power is shifted. And to do that, our sense is that you need to move beyond, if you think about our work in collective impact as doing a work in a container, I'm guessing some of you use that phrase of, we have to create a container within which to do the work. What we're really talking about is a radical container, right? It's something that probably doesn't feel all that comfortable if you're going to try it on right now, for many of you, for some it may. But as we were trying to figure out sort of what it took to support transformation, both with individuals and with communities, we went back to, the Eastern and Western spiritual traditions to, how indigenous peoples think about transformation, truth and reconciliation, and other ways that people have thought about sort of supporting transformation in individuals and groups. And we observed sort of 5 qualities, and I'm just going to walk through them briefly. The first was, Jen, maybe you can click, that there's a focus on interchange, that and at this point, I'm guessing most of you, this is not a new notion for you, but it's a critical notion to this work that, we need to get to a compassionate heart and a sensing mind. Our ability to understand our own triggers and the impacts we have on others is so critical to sort of creating an openness, and an openness within us is what creates an openness within the work. And so it does start with us. And so the inner work is Peter Senge, mentor of mine, talks about, the success of the intervention is based on the interior condition of the intervener. So interchange is clearly part of it. And deep relational work comes from that, because it's interchange not only of the individual, but interchange of the system. And you've got to get sort of below the sort of, regular relationships into sort of real deep listening, where sort of two organizations, two cultures can sort of come together, remain intact, but a third way emerges. Mulaney Goodchild, who's an indigenous systems thinker and colleague of ours, talks about this third possibility while cultures and organizations can remain intact. That's what we seek, but that's real deep relational work as opposed to just coming together in relationship. The third is a space for healing. I think one of our realizations is that we got deeper into this work, and something I feel I would not have said 10 years ago, but I feel strongly about now, is that trauma lies at the heart of really almost any social or environmental issue that we face. Trauma lies at the heart, and people are traumatized, and because systems are made up of people, systems are traumatized. And we're starting to do more and more work around this, but I think it's pretty clear that, making a space for, allowing, traumas to be shared and healing to, be sort of come into the space is critical. It's obviously very nuanced work for many of us. It's very new work, but, it's critical. And I think there can be there can be sort of a perspective in its particular Western mindset that, let's leave behind the past. We don't understand why people can't just get over it. We've heard stuff like that, and we know that in and of itself is triggering and harmful. So making a space for healing at a systems level becomes really, really, really critical if we're interested in transformation. Jen, if you could click the next one, power has to transform, because power in most instances prevents any level of healing. So if we don't shift power, the system can't transform. And so how do we lower the threshold for power sharing and power redistribution? We're happy to talk a little bit more about our work in this arena, but our sense is, we see power shifting when the values of those that are in power shift. And that happens when they're in relationship, back to this notion of relationship. And then finally, the final quality, which we call serendipity in the sacred. Somewhere, 1300s, 1400s, with the advent of dominant culture worldwide, there was a sense that spirituality should be separated from like the rational stuff and the problem-solving stuff. But, non-dominant cultures don't separate the sacred from just life. Indigenous cultures don't. And so, as we think about sort of social and environmental problem solving, we can't just have the sacred out there. And in fact, the sacred is an aid. It's bringing ritual into the work. And this isn't about religion. It's about sort of acknowledging that there's a larger source that we as human beings can draw off of. And it's an amazing resource and source, particularly when people are in connection with each other. So it's not only an individual, but it's definitely a community. Thank you. It's all interconnected. So yeah, but that means that how do we create the conditions for the sacred and serendipity to arise that nobody sort of could have predicted? I mean, the reality is if we knew the answers to all the issues in the world today, we'd have done them, right? We don't know the answers. There's some level of surprise that comes out of introducing the sacred into a situation. So again, this is a frame that we're working with. It is oriented towards transformation. So when I think you look at each of these areas, they may feel like a high bar for your collective impact effort. But I think, if they feel like a direction you want to move in, I think the way that we orient around this is you start moving in this direction. You don't have to do it all. In fact, when we think about how this shows up in the work, typically you sort of enter through one of these pathways and it'll get you to the others if you're really intentional about the work. So with that, yeah, let's jump into questions.
All right. Thank you, John. And Juanita, also thank you for helping us enter this space in such a beautiful way. So we have collected a handful of questions from folks prior to the session, and we have selected a handful to start with. And then we also encourage people on the line to submit additional questions in the Q&A box. So I'm going to dive in with the first question, and I'm going to take the slides down so we can see you. So could you talk a little bit about how to support groups to move through the discomfort of changing practice while systems are still chugging away as usual?
You want to...
You want me to start, or do you want to
start? Want to do like rock, paper, scissors? No. You can start. It's good.
Okay. Well, yeah, this is a great question. You know, it's the sort of changing the gears on the 747 while flying it. There's other bad metaphors like that. But I think what, you know, I've come to appreciate is it's really hard for people to change without some help and some capacity building. And so I'll just sort of give one example of you know, community that we worked in for actually about 1.5 to 2 years. Staten Island, which is one of the boroughs of New York City, it's about 500,000 people. So it's a sizable, you know, quote unquote community. And, you know, one of the approaches that we took there, and we've applied it in some other places as well, but was literally to, while we were doing the work of collective impact, which started with developing a common agenda over the course of, I don't know, 8 or 10 months, and then sort of, you know, beginning to engage at a working group level, is that we were building capacity for change while we were doing the work. So we actually, in this instance, brought in some, you know, supplemental support from Peter Senge, who I mentioned earlier, who's a sort of a systems guru, and colleagues of his. And while we were doing the work and bringing data to bear and had a group of, you know, 25, 30, 35 people that were doing some of the initial work together, we were also building their capacity to change and to think through a systems lens and through a change lens. So there are lots of models of change. And I think for, you know, I'll say that my experience is that a lot of systems work and sort of change work is about awareness. It's about awareness of our own blind spots, awareness of how to think about, you know, interconnections and sort of things like, you know, the way that nonlinear change happens. And so it's helpful to, you know, we went through sort of collective capacity building with that group while we were also doing the work. So we were able to do, you know, shift back and forth between, you know, learning that was valuable for people as individuals and could be valuable for their organizations as well, but also valuable for the effort as a whole. And I have to say, I think it worked really well. It also, I think, it brought the group even more closely together. Because I think anytime, you know, a group of people are collectively learning and that's well, you know, facilitated, it does build relationship. So I think, you know, so longer story, or a story that sort of illustrates, at least in my mind, that it's hard to tell people to change if you don't sort of give them different tools that can help their awareness in a different way. So thinking about how you can build that in, how you know, take advantage of people in your local community that can help bring that capacity, you know, because we do have to think and do differently if we're going to see change. But just telling people to do that, it, you know, can create frustration. Doing it sort of in a way that's learning can, I think, really be super powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I want to make sure that we get through more questions, but I would just add, in a way, moving through discomfort is changing already. When we start to feel that discomfort, I would just also caution us how much we've been rejecting being in discomfort. I think we have become a society where we want to be a lot always okay, and everything to go okay. And there's no way that that's going to happen, right? We need, if we're going to do the work honestly and fully with ourselves and embracing and with love, and it is going to be uncomfortable. So I would just end with a call for learning to love that discomfort and knowing that it is going to take you to a better place.
Great, thank you both. The next question I'm going to ask came in prior to the webinar. How do we involve those who find the relationship building phase takes too long to feel efficient?
Yes, maybe I can keep on building from my last comment, and that is the work. Trying to let go of our desire for efficiency is the work that we need, is the change that we need to have. I was just last weekend in California, actually. I'm in Boston myself, or north of Boston, and I was in an organization called Californians for Justice. And they are an originally movement building organization, really youth-led and super, strong and activist. And they have gone through this transformation of being an organization that works, to push the system to work with the system. And right now they have this approach called relationship-centered schools, and they've evolved over time. Now they've grown to be, in, I don't know, 5, 6 cities, in districts. And I went there to actually interview all the different system players, because I mostly have known the work through Californians for Justice. And my first interview was actually with assistant superintendent. And she was just basically saying to me, the first time when I started working with Californians for Justice, I was a little bit like, whoa, what is this, right? And honestly, there has been in our communities this kind of push from a lot of community organizations. And, she's you can tell that she's a woman that has her own bias work, but even with all that, you're sitting in this position with this authority and it's uncomfortable, and you're not used to working in this way. And, great, Norma. So shout out to that beautiful organization. And she's like, but I went along with it. I said, okay, I'm going to give it a try, just because I had to in some ways to save face. And she has come to love the way that California for Justice works, even if it is just in the containers that they built, which was so foreign to her. And she's like, I was used to why are we wasting this much time? And now I understand that being in relationship with each other is what the work is about. And being in what Californians for Justice has taught her to be, in their own meetings, she has carried it on through her own work with her own staff internally, not only about working only with the youth, right? And she was saying they've done a lot of great work. They just came out with this amazing equity policy binding. She said, still really difficult. We're still moving so slowly. And she feels the pressure from a lot of, her community, a lot of the students, that they're not achieving racial equity fast enough. And she feels that pain. So there is this full tension. And yet the next day when I saw her in community with the rest of the youth and the other schools, I realized that her fear is a fear of love. It's not only fear on efficiency of only accountability. It's a fear of true love for the people that she's built these relationships with. And she will continue to be, or they will all as a community continue to be, tugging between that being relational and achieving the outcomes that they need to achieve for the youth who are aging out in a system that has failed them. And yet knowing that that tension is inevitable. And if you cheat any of those two sides, you're basically on it's going to break. You're going to go back to the status quo. So yeah, hard work. I don't think that there's a full answer for this, but we can't shy away from it.
I love that example. Thanks for sharing that. It makes me think, and I'm going to refer to a couple of the comments that I've seen come up in the chat box. Sorry, can't speak today. I think, and I know, Jen, some of you may have heard me say this before, when we think about sort of how do we shift to people the way people think, their mental model, we often think that it's, we have to get them to think differently so that they do differently. But the reality is the more powerful way of shifting a mental model is to get people to do something differently, and then they think differently. And so the illustration that Juanita, you just gave was, somebody just started doing something because they kind of felt, they would at least try it, or they were asked to, and all of a sudden they could feel that it was a different experience. So I could have sat down with her and said, listen, check-in is a really great thing. You should, even though it takes 15 minutes, you should really do it, blah, blah, blah. But once you experience it, you understand that there's a connection there, and that actually makes the work better. And I think, I think somebody had said, the efficiency is more of a status quo. We want to improve things. We want to sort of get things moving more quickly the way they are right now versus transforming them. And I would agree. And I think we're up against a sort of a worldview and a mindset that, it is not one that's going to produce transformation. So, and yet, many of the people who are in senior positions and positions of power, are, even if they're good-willed people, have very little time and they just want to be efficient, right? I feel that way often. I think what I find to be helpful with people like that, and one of the other questions was, how do you demonstrate that this works? Well, you just sort of get people into doing it. So, in the education space, superintendent doing, shadowing a student, and all of a sudden seeing the world differently and developing a relationship differently, in a variety of venues, collective impact efforts and other collaborative efforts will collectively go on a learning journey where they're, the old days we used to call it sort of a site visit, but, really getting into what's happening and, being out in the field together and having dialogue about that. Even something as simple as a data walk and putting people together who in relationship with, who haven't been in relationship, and asking them to, interpret the information. Some light bulbs will go off differently for people who are very efficiency driven, that, gee, I learned something. So I think, transformation is fundamentally about human development, individual and group development. And I think most really, we're all wired to want to grow and develop. And I think helping people that are in that efficiency mode just have a different experience where they're learning, and it puts them in relationship differently, and then they'll want to do it again. I guarantee you, because I've seen it too many times.
Great, great. So I'm also looking here at the Q&A box, and we have a question with 5 upvotes. So I'm going to start there. What can you do in situations where you cannot get the system in the room, as you said, John? I've been working with a community where the local government and school have not had good relations for over 15 years.
Yeah. John, you want to?
No, go for it.
Yes, I don't know. I would love, John, from your experience, what you've done. In moments where this has happened to me, and I'm mostly thinking of my work in Colombia. There's also a tension between acknowledging the past, right? You're arriving to a system that has.
Sorry.
Why are you laughing?
I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at, if you feed them, they will come. Sorry.
I thought I had. Okay, I'm like, what? So there is some of the work that John has been working on is on trauma. It's been working a lot is on systems trauma or collective trauma, and to really realize that there is a lot of, we know this, but there really is a lot of trauma. They're like the depth of the trauma that exists is incredible for everyone, needless to say, for so much more than for others. But when you're arriving to a system and there's been such a history, you can not recognize that. There has been a history of discomfort, of tensions. That doesn't necessarily go away just with good intentions or with a lot of effort. In me, there's been the moments in which I have had to let go of my own resentments and try to go to those who might not be close together, start to build relationships one-on-one before I'm able to bring the group together. And act like that bridge, and I think a lot of us in collective impact, that's what we are. We're acting as a bridge, but we are often arriving to as the bridge built versus building the bridge little by little. And again, we're going back to efficiency. So sometimes trust needs to be more handheld than truly just, put on, and I don't know what is the particular situation, than just to put the will and the intention there. And like ultimately, just, I guess, is asking that question, is there something that needs to be acknowledged? Is there a trauma that needs to be publicly acknowledged before you can come in together? And that might be a needed starting point. Now, if the question is on the other side, because there's this power dynamics, then that is a different, if the people are not coming to the table because they're afraid of losing their power, because they're still so power hungry, that is the moment where maybe, the pushing of the community activism might start to get the floor, to loosen up the floor. So, I mean that.
Yeah, I think the reality is there's like no one answer at all. It's all context driven. So yeah, it might be, the community activism is the way to go. I think, we've had the good fortune of getting to know a collective impact effort in Brownsville. And David and Casa are the backbone leaders. I can't remember their last names. They're wonderful people. David
Carrington, yeah. Anyway.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, and they tell a wonderful story. I actually think we've got it recorded on our website about so it's early childhood in Brownsville, in New York City, and they took the parents to essentially City Hall to where the government I can't remember which department it was, and so. And they went and they sat around a room with the parents there and the government officials, and the parents couldn't get data. And they just started telling their stories. And, what somebody within the government said is, I didn't realize until you started telling your stories that, I've got some very similar, things that have happened to me. And so then you start to establish a connection that, wasn't there before. And that was just a beautiful story of, they took themselves to, the government officials and that's what did it. And then the way that they sort of, and actually over time, and they talk about this, the data door opened up and they were able to get, much better data from the government. But it started with relationship and it started with story. And over and over again, I think we are seeing the power of story and people sharing their stories, how critical that is in the trauma work, that people's stories, people can share their stories, and their stories, people can hear their stories. So, my first answer would be don't give up. The second is there are lots of strategies, not one. Yes, storytelling is sacred. And third is find ways to help people get into relationship that isn't necessarily immediately about sort of the ask. Obviously, you want to be there for a reason, but I don't give up and find ways to have people share their stories and get into a relationship.
Yeah, you may have mostly answered this in the reflections you just shared, but there's a question in the Q&A box around looking for advice for some tangible practices that you use to begin to build relationships amongst between community members and across organizations. So you talked, of course, now about the power of storytelling and finding points of personal connection. Anything else come up for either one of you you'd like to share?
Yeah, we have, I can give you a couple of examples and also mention that the examples are also going to be very related to who you are, right? Like there's some ways, sometimes we adopt other ways of being, of engaging relationship with each other that might not feel correct to us. So my first question is like, how do you build your own relationships when you're outside work? And could you bring that into the work? Some of the things that we've seen, and we have a case study, the power of healing circles. There is, I think whenever the main thing that I would want to say is try to make sure that when you're building those relationships, it's not transactional, that you truly are there to build the relationship, right? Regardless of the outcome. So creating spaces where that is it, that is the purpose, the outcome is the way of connecting with each other, will change the way that the relationship starts or the relationship gets nurtured. I find that the idea of the healing circles, that a lot of communities have it. And in fact, we want to say that even we see it very present in indigenous communities, First Nation communities. But you think about it, and it's another way of storytelling that is present in most of us, in most of our lives. But there is a moment in which you decide to make the space sacred, either by ritual or, there's people get trained by this, but even if you do it, we're going to make the space today sacred. And then the power of the healing circle is that each person goes on telling their story without interruption and just from the I perspective. This is not about answering. This is not about a convincing. This is about you showing your truth, your only truth. And you are sitting there when you agree to be part of the circle. You're agreeing to let the process take its shape and to be just present. I have been part of many healing circles, and both here and in Colombia, and it can be uncomfortable and it can be long. But 99% of the time for me is transformative, not only with who I'm sitting with, but with myself. And so healing circles is one of them. I also encourage, and this is something that we saw from our friends in New Zealand, working, David Hanna and their group working with Mongrel Mob, and let's just do, they went to camp, camping together with the local gangs. And it wasn't like I'm saying to you, go camping with your local gang. I'm saying, make the decision to do something that is just about being together and getting to know each other and your families. How few times do we start, even some of our icebreakers are, what are you worried? Why can't we just share a little bit more about, tell me a childhood, what was your favorite childhood game? How can we arrive to spaces and just get to know each other? So some are complicated, but even if you have very small time, I think that's, again, Californians for Justice. You don't start a meeting in that place without a check-in. Another place here in Boston, in Lowell, Massachusetts, UTech, they start with mood check and one question. So those little rituals start to build that relationship, and they're not silly, they're not meaningless, they're so important, so important.
Great. A question here is, how do you keep the relationship building going through changes in personnel and mandates in the collaborating organizations and agencies? It's a real thing that folks often are facing.
Yeah, and it's a real thing, and it happens a lot. The collective impact efforts that I've seen be really effective over time through those transitions are the ones that build a really strong culture and set of values, and sort of relational trust. What I've observed in some efforts even sort of when an initial set of folks are working on the common agenda and then, becomes shared out in the community and more people get involved, if there's been real strong sort of social fabric work done initially, other people enter in much more easily than when there hasn't been. It's really, Peter Senge talks about sort of, how, so we talk about systems and we talk about ecosystems all the time, right? Well, ecosystems are nature. So let's stop treating the notion of ecosystems as if it were a mechanical thing. How does nature sort of harmonize? Well, if you're talking about a pond or a brook, or you're talking about a field or, woods, and, if it gets out of harmony and a certain part of the, the woods or the pond, start harmonizing better, nature around it starts to harmonize to that harmony. And so it's just, I think, a real important example, and we are nature. We are people, we are nature. And so the fact that I can observe when there's a really strong social fabric, somebody new stepping into that and feeling more a part of things more earlier isn't surprising. And so I think the same has to, can apply to new people moving in and moving out. And I've seen this, where if there's strength in the social fabric, it's a lot easier for that to maintain, even if somebody fairly significant to the effort leaves.
All right, thank you. A question is, how can we acknowledge the anger that some people feel, but also move the work forward?
You want me to go?
Yeah, I'm happy to go, but I want to hear what you have to say first.
Yeah. Jen, I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question perfectly, but can you read it again?
Sure. How can we acknowledge the anger that some people feel, but also move the work forward? That's how the question was phrased. And I would say, and also move the work forward.
Exactly. Yeah, that's actually a very good distinction. Yeah, again, it's hard to answer these questions without dialogue, because I'm not sure whoever is asking them what is truly in your mind and in your heart. There's some moments of such great trauma that I'm not sure it's so easy to let go of it. And I don't know if you can get past it but might take a lifetime, So again, go back a little bit with the discomfort. There is anger that needs to be acknowledged and needs to be respected, without a doubt. Like, there's been great suffering that has occurred in the past and currently and continues to occur, right, at both individual and at a collective level. And there's ways in which the anger, I honor it, right? There's moments in which we do have to, it's not okay. It's not okay. Things that happen, that continue to happen, I don't know, how can you let go of anger whenever we continue to have mass killings, and you get a little bit past it and then it goes back again. So I think we're going to have to get through working with it and finding a way to, in many cases, use that anger to not be jaded and to continue to feel raw about what is truly important and continue to do the work. I just mentioned I'm from Colombia. One of my most transformative experiences in my life was when I was, late 20s. I was living during the 90s in Colombia. For those who are in here who understand what that is, I was living in La Zona Roja, which is in the red zone, and in a town called Chimichagua. And it was a place that was actually just in the middle of the territory that was, the north was paramilitary and the south was guerrilla. And the town was anyway, the point is it was deep, deep conflict. And I arrived there, like being from the city, which we had a different type of violence. We had the narco violence, but the cities didn't get the same level of violence as the rural area. And I arrived there, and I think in this town, every single person after I learned had someone directly had been kidnapped or killed by one of the two, or the third, which is the army, right? And I was just like in shock, even though coming from Colombia, I have actually traveled the world, and I was in a place where like the reality was incredibly foreign to me. And I couldn't get past how joyful and kind and loving people were to me, right? To each other, of course, but to this stranger who just arrived, who didn't even necessarily look like them, who's just like parachuted from the city. And I would go to like the veredas, days walking, and I would find joy everywhere. And I remember after I developed some relationships, I asked, one of my, I was training just leaders in mediation and conflict resolution. And I asked, how is this possible? How is this possible? Like, you're not like angry? And then he said, yes, I am. Yes, I am. My father got killed in front of me. So many of us have been people that have been killed in front of us. And I choose to hope. Hope is a choice. And I have no other choice. For my children, I have to let go. And after that, I'm not entitled to let the anger get over me. I feel it, but I'm not entitled to be prey of it. So I respect it, I honor it, I use it, and I'm choosing hope is my obligation.
Thank you for sharing that story, Juanita. We're going to take one more question, and I'm going to kind of combine a few that touch on the idea of capacity building. So supporting folks to work in these new and different ways. And John, you referenced capacity building a few times in the Staten Island work that you referenced. But could you give a few examples of what that capacity building might look like in order to give folks something more concrete to take away?
Yeah, sure. And, I want to qualify it too, because our orientation, as we said at the outset, is towards transformational. So what we would see as capacity building may not be like where, somebody listening is. So, I think something like, this question of anger, I think, is critical. Just in my experience doing collective impact for over a decade, I'm at a very different place with this question of anger. I don't think we could just like pass over it. I can think of communities I've worked in, one specifically where, the work went quite well for a year and then it kind of fell apart. And I think it fell apart because we didn't address the anger at the beginning. Or the leaders of the effort didn't address the anger at the beginning. So I think, really, sort of, and there are some really great, people working in the area of trauma and healing and collective healing. And I think that's a really important part to the work. It may not feel like that's exactly what folks, are ready for, but there is, capacity building that can happen there. We talked about circles earlier. I think that's a really important and critical sort of, model that's used in many, many cultures, and there are different ways to do it. And there's good training capacity that people can get in that. And, that brings in a couple of the qualities of, how do you bring the sacred in a way that's not weird and, wooey, but actually, is part of where human beings are. So, yeah, Juanita, I don't know what you would add to that.
No, I think you did a great job.
Okay, thank you. I think that is probably the last question that we all have an opportunity to take today. Thank you all. I want to first say I see several folks sharing links in the chat. It looks like I want to see if people can do the Control A to select it all and Control C to copy that down. We don't share the chat because we don't want to share private chats and things like that if those get captured. So we will also try to find a way to get you links if that Control A, Control C is not working. But John is going to share a closing poem with us before we head out. And then I will wrap with a few opportunities to learn more from the Collective Change Lab and other Collective Impact Forum resources. So go ahead and grab the chat. And then, John, I will turn it to you before I close us out.
Thank you. Well, yes. First of all, I enjoyed all the questions, and really, Juanita and I appreciated the opportunity, and we as an organization, really relish what we're learning from all of you. I'm just going to close with something called patient trust. So maybe some of you have heard of it. It goes like this. Above all, trust in the slow work of love. We are quite naturally impatient in everything to reach the end without delay. We should like to skip the intermediate stages. We are impatient of being on the way to something unknown, something new. And yet it is the law of all progress that it is made by passing through some stages of instability, and that it may take a very long time. And so I think it is with you. Your ideas mature gradually. Let them grow. Let them shape themselves without undue haste. Don't try to force them on as though you could be today with time. That is to say, grace and circumstances acting on your own goodwill will make of you tomorrow. Only love could say what this new spirit gradually forming within you will be. Give love the benefit of believing that her hand is leading you, and accept the anxiety of feeling yourself in suspense and incomplete.
Oh. I love it.
That's wonderful. Thank you, John. John or Juanita, if you could just put in the chat where folks might be able to find that poem while I manage a screen share, that would be wonderful. I think folks really appreciated that.
Yeah,
Great. So we are so glad that we have the opportunity to welcome the Collective Change Lab back for 2 more sessions. This was our May session. Then on June 7th, we'll be chatting about what does it mean to lead in an emergent and transformational way. And then on July 20th, how can we tell stories of systems change that are more reflective of the way change happens? And I saw some questions that actually touched on both of these topics, in particular, following up on the storytelling theme. So really encourage you to join us. John will be on both of those. Their colleague, Catherine, will join us in June and Cynthia in July. And Juanita, thank you for joining us today. I also want to let folks know that there's a wonderful piece that Juanita, John, and Catherine authored in a series on the Stanford Social Innovation Review that is going deeper into the full flower graphic that John voiced over. It is one of 15 different pieces that are all exploring different dimensions of collective impact and centering equity and collective impact. So these are all included, and the slides will be made available as a PDF as well after today's session. And then finally, we have a podcast. If you haven't tuned in before, please feel free to check out the Collective Impact Forum's podcast, where we explore a range of types of conversations, including ones like today, also some very practical how-to sessions. And you can also find audio from several past keynote presentations and conference sessions. And so we encourage you to check out the podcast if you want to learn more. So with that, I will thank you. Thank you to our colleague, Tracy, who has been managing things behind the scenes, and wish everyone good health in these, again, tough times. And thank you for joining. We hope to see you in a few weeks at our June session. Take care.